"Officer, we know exactly why you're sitting here every Tuesday. Same little routine. Buy one coffee, take up a whole booth, pretend you're waiting on somebody who isn't coming." Yvonne Marchand kept her hands folded over her purse and said nothing for a long moment, the way she'd learned to do at the DMV counter for 31 years before her pension finally let her rest. Her hip didn't let her stand quick anymore, not since the fall on the ice outside her apartment in Scarborough, and her cane was hooked over the edge of the table where Constable Drudge could see it plain as day and still not care. "I paid for my coffee," she said. "I'm waiting on my granddaughter. She's late, that's all." "Nobody's late 40 minutes in this weather unless they're not coming," Drudge said, and the younger one beside him, Constable Pell, laughed into his collar like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all shift. "Ma'am, this is a place of business," Pell said, "not a shelter." That word landed on her like a slap, and the diner went quiet around them the way rooms do right before something happens. Yvonne was 72 years old. She'd buried a husband and raised 2 children and outlived a sister, and she had never once in her life been spoken to like she was garbage somebody forgot to take out. Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, and Drudge reached over and closed his hand around her wrist, not hard, but firm enough that the message was clear. "Sit, be quiet, disappear." A chair scraped back near the window. The man who stood up was tall in the way that made the whole diner feel smaller, with a gray beard kept close and a flannel jacket that had seen better winters. He didn't say anything threatening. He didn't need to. "Take your hand off her." Drudge looked over with the kind of smirk men wear when they've never once in their lives been told no by somebody who meant it. "This isn't your business, friend. It is now." Neither officer had any idea that the quiet man with the gray beard had spent 11 years flying medevac helicopters out of forward bases. Nobody back home ever heard the names of, and Yvonne Marchand had no idea that the humiliation she was about to survive in a Tim Hortons off Lawrence Avenue would, inside of 4 months, put her name on the door of a building that hadn't been built yet. Comment below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens to these 2 officers by the end of this story. 6 weeks before any of that, Yvonne Marchand woke up the way she always did, at 5:15 before her alarm, because her body had kept government hours so long it didn't know how to stop. The apartment was cold. The landlord kept saying he'd look at the radiator and never did, and she'd learned not to push it because the rent was already $11 more than it should be, and she didn't want to give him a reason to remember her unit existed. She lay there a minute, listening to the pipes tick, doing the math she did every morning now. Pension, rent, hydro, the new copay on her blood pressure medication that her old plan used to cover and didn't anymore, since the province changed the formulary. There wasn't a version of that math that came out even, not most months, and she'd taken to walking to the Shoppers 2 bus stops further than the one near her building, because the pharmacist there didn't sigh when she asked if there was a generic. Down the hall, her grandson Decene was still asleep on the pullout, 17 years old and folded up too long for that mattress, one arm hanging off the edge toward the floor like he'd given up on the whole arrangement sometime in the night. He'd come to live with her in September, after things at his mother's place went the way they'd been going for a while. And Yvonne hadn't asked many questions, because some doors you don't open twice, you just hold them shut and let the person on the other side decide when they're ready to talk. He was a good boy underneath the silence. Quick with numbers, quicker with an attitude when teachers pushed, and carrying something heavy enough that he flinched sometimes at raised voices, even ones that weren't aimed at him. She made his lunch before she made her coffee, same as always. Habits like that didn't ask permission, they just stayed. The walk to Mabon's, the little diner 2 blocks from her building, had become the one piece of her day that belonged only to her. 40 minutes, sometimes longer if Desine's granddaughter, her actual granddaughter, Talia, the one who still called every Sunday from Halifax, where she was finishing her nursing degree, managed to video call, and they'd talk about nothing important until the coffee went cold. Yvonne would sit by the window, watch the streetcars, let her hip rest, and pretend for a little while that her whole life wasn't measured out in bus transfers and prescription copays. She didn't know that Constable Rourke Drudge had been told, in a meeting 2 days earlier, that no one outside a small circle was ever meant to hear about that the block around Mabon's was getting cleaned up ahead of a site visit from a development group called Penrose Urban, who were eyeing the whole strip for a 12-story mixed-use tower. She didn't know that the diner's elderly regulars, the ones who nursed a single coffee for an hour because that was all their budgets allowed, had become, in the language of a closed-door planning meeting, an image liability. She only knew that for the last 2 weeks, the same 2 constables had been finding reasons to walk through Mabon's at the exact hour she usually sat there, and that their reasons had started getting personal. The morning everything changed started like any of the others. Desian had a chemistry test he hadn't studied for, and wouldn't admit it. Yvonne pressed $11 into his hand for the bus, and told him to eat something before he left, and he mumbled something that might have been thank you, and she let herself believe it was. Then she put on her good coat, the navy one with the buttons that still held even though the lining had started to go, and made her way to Mabon's the same as every Tuesday, settling into the booth by the window, with her cane hooked over the edge of the table. She didn't notice the man with the gray beard until later. He came in most mornings, too, sat near the back with a paperback and a black coffee he never seemed to finish, never said much to anybody, the kind of regular a diner absorbs without remembering when they started showing up. His name was Corbin Achibi, though nobody in that diner knew it yet, and he had a way of watching a room without seeming to watch it at all. An old habit from years spent reading the mood of a medevac bird before the radio confirmed what he already knew. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Yvonne Marchand had spent half her career working the front counter of a provincial licensing office. The kind of job where you become genuinely excellent at staying calm while strangers yell at you about paperwork that isn't your fault, and that this particular skill was about to matter more than anyone in that diner could have guessed. Drudge and Pell came in at 9:15, the same as the last 4 Tuesdays, ostensibly on a coffee break, though Yvonne had begun to suspect their captain knew nothing about how that break was being spent. They didn't order anything. They walked the length of the diner like they were inspecting a kennel, and when Drudge's eyes landed on Yvonne, something in his face changed. The particular boredom of a man who has decided a person in front of him is not quite a person, just an inconvenience wearing a coat. "Officer, we know exactly why you're sitting here every Tuesday," he started, and the rest unspooled the way it does in these moments. Faster than it should, each sentence a little crueler than the one before, until his hand closed around her wrist, and Corbin Achibi stood up from his booth like a door swinging open. The confrontation that followed lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though it felt, to everyone in the diner, considerably longer. Corbin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed himself between the 2 officers and the old woman in the navy coat, and something in his stillness made Pell take a half-step back without seeming to decide to. Drudge, the kind of man who reads retreat as invitation, squared up. "You want to make this a thing, friend? I want you to take your hand off her and walk out of here. That's all I want." It might have ended there, with nothing more than wounded pride on the officer's side, if the diner's owner, a tired, kind man named Walter Odioyoy, who'd taken over the place from his father, hadn't stepped out from behind the counter at that exact moment with his phone already raised, recording, because Walter had watched these 2 corner an elderly regular 3 separate times in 2 weeks and had finally had enough of staying neutral in his own restaurant. Drudge saw the phone a half-second too late. What he said next: "Nobody's coming to save you, lady. This neighborhood's getting cleared whether you like it or not," would, in 4 months' time, be played on a loop in a city council chamber that he had no idea existed yet. For now, though, all that happened was that Drudge and Pell left, muttering about filing a report, and the diner exhaled all at once, and Yvonne Marchand sat very still, with her hands shaking in her lap in a way she was furious at herself for not being able to control. Corbin sat down across from her without asking. "You all right?" "I've had worse mornings," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie, though her voice wobbled saying it. "I don't doubt that." He nodded at her cane. "What happened?" "Ice, outside my building, 2 winters back. Healed wrong." She studied him for a second, the careful, sizing-up look of a woman who'd spent 3 decades reading strangers across a counter. "You didn't have to do that. Felt like somebody did." That was the entirety of their conversation that first day. but Walter refused to let either of them pay for their coffee, and from that Tuesday on, without either of them quite arranging it, Corbin Atchebe started sitting one booth closer to the window. What Yvonne didn't learn until much later, in pieces, the way you learn things about someone who doesn't talk about himself easily, was that Corbin had flown medevac for 11 years before a rotor failure outside Kandahar put 3 pins in his shoulder and ended that career permanently. He'd come home to a city that thanked him with a parade nobody attended and a disability claim that took 14 months to process, during which he'd lost the apartment he'd kept for a decade and learned the hard way what it felt like to be looked through by people who used to look up to him. He didn't talk about any of that. He talked about hockey, badly, and about a daughter in Vancouver he saw twice a year, and about how the coffee at Mabon's was the only thing in his life that hadn't changed in 5 years. The two of them became, without either one naming it, something like friends. Tuesdays turned into most weekdays. Corbin started walking Yvonne home when the weather turned, not making a thing of it, just falling into step beside her like it had always been the arrangement. He met Decien once, briefly, and said almost nothing to him, which the boy seemed to appreciate more than any amount of forced conversation could have managed. Drudge and Pell didn't come back to Mabon's for 9 days. When they did, it was with backup, and it was not for coffee. The second confrontation happened on a Thursday, and this time it wasn't really about Yvonne at all, though she was standing in the middle of it once again. Walter Oduyoy had received 3 days prior a visit from a city bylaw officer citing a list of infractions in his diner so minor and so suddenly enforced: a crack in the sidewalk tile out front, a fire extinguisher inspection 2 weeks overdue, a sign that was apparently 1 centimeter too large, that even the bylaw officer seemed faintly embarrassed reading them aloud. Walter, who had run a clean kitchen for 19 years, understood immediately what was happening even if he couldn't yet prove it. Someone wanted Mabon's gone, and they were using every small lever available to make that happen quietly. This time, when Drudge walked in, he wasn't there to harass an old woman over a cup of coffee. He was there with a clipboard and a posture of false courtesy, informing Walter that the diner would need to close for the day pending a structural review, a review that, as it turned out, had been requested by an entity called Penrose Urban Holdings, a name that meant nothing to Walter and even less to Yvonne, who happened to be sitting in her usual booth when the news arrived. It was Corbin who asked the obvious question. Penrose Urban, who are they? Nobody had an answer. Not yet. What followed over the next several weeks was less a single dramatic confrontation and more a slow tightening, the kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself as an attack until you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Mabon's was closed for review 3 separate times. A petition began circulating among the building's longtime tenants, most of them elderly, most of them on fixed incomes, encouraging them to accept a buyout offer before the building was redeveloped, language that everyone understood to mean they would not be welcome to stay regardless of whether they accepted the money or not. Yvonne, with her decades of bureaucratic instinct, was the one who noticed the pattern first. She'd spent half her career reading file numbers and permit codes, and something about the speed of the inspections, the specific language repeated across different city notices, the way 3 separate departments all seemed to be moving in lockstep toward the same outcome, struck her as far too coordinated to be coincidence. She started keeping notes, dates, names, the badge numbers off, every notice that came through the diner's door, copied carefully into the same small notebook she'd once used to track license renewals. It was Corbin, oddly, who connected the final piece, simply because he still had contacts from his years in uniform who owed him favors. A former squadron mate, now working in municipal records, did some quiet digging and came back with something neither of them expected. Penrose Urban Holdings was not, as its glossy name suggested, some faceless investment firm. It was substantially owned, through 2 shell companies, by a city councilor's brother-in-law, the same councilor who sat on the very committee responsible for approving zoning variances in that exact neighborhood. "That's not a coincidence," Yvonne said, when Corbin laid it out for her across their usual booth. "That's a crime. Proving it's a crime is a different thing than knowing it's one." She thought about that for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, the way she used to turn a problem over before deciding how to file it. I spent 31 years behind a counter people screamed at because the system was unfair, and I was the only part of it they could reach. I know how this works. Somebody decides what's true before the truth even gets a chance to speak. So what do? We make sure the truth gets a chance. It took another 5 weeks to build what they needed. Walter kept every notice he received, every email, every form, building a paper trail without fully understanding yet how it would be used. Yvonne, with a patience that had served her through 3 decades of difficult counterwork, reached out to a tenant advocacy group downtown, small non-profit running on grant money and stubbornness, run by a sharp young woman named Priscilla Annan, who had 2 years fighting exactly this kind of quiet, paperwork-driven displacement and recognized the pattern within 10 minutes of hearing it. Corbin, meanwhile, did something neither he nor Yvonne discussed in advance. He went to the press, not a major outlet. Those doors don't open easily for a retired flight medic and a retired licensing clerk with a notebook full of badge numbers. He went, instead, to a local independent reporter named Owen Fenwick, who ran a small but well-respected city affairs newsletter, the kind read closely by exactly the sort of people who sit on municipal oversight committees. Fenwick listened to the whole story over coffee at, fittingly, Mabon's, and by the end of it he had stopped taking notes and started recording. The story broke on a Monday morning under the headline, "Who Owns Penrose Urban? And Why is City Hall Helping Them Empty a Block?" It included photographs of the bylaw notices, a timeline of the inspections, and, most damning of all, the ownership records connecting Penrose Urban to the councillor's family. It did not yet include the diner confrontation footage. Fenwick had decided wisely to save that. The reaction was immediate and considerably larger than anyone involved had anticipated. Other outlets picked it up within hours. The councillor in question issued a statement calling the allegations deeply misleading, which only intensified scrutiny rather than calming it. And 3 days later, a public council meeting was scheduled, ostensibly to discuss neighborhood zoning concerns, though everyone who'd read Fenwick's piece understood it for what it actually was. Yvonne almost didn't go. Her hip had been bothering her badly that week, the cold settling into the joint the way it did every November, and some old, deep part of her, the part trained over 3 decades to stay quiet, to not make a scene, to let people above her decide what mattered, almost won out. It was Desian, of all people, who changed her mind. He'd been quiet through the whole ordeal, watching from the edges the way he watched most things, but on the morning of the council meeting he came out of his room already dressed, holding her good coat. "You're going," he said. "Not a question. Desian, that man called you garbage in front of everybody, and you just sat there because you didn't have a choice. You have a choice now. Use it." She looked at her grandson for a long moment, 17 years old, and still learning how to carry whatever weight had been handed to him before he was ready for it, and something in his certainty steadied her more than any amount of her own courage could have. She took the coat. The council chamber was fuller than anyone expected for a Tuesday afternoon meeting about zoning. Word had spread through the neighborhood the way it does when people sense an old wrong is finally being weighed. Walter was there. Priscilla Annan sat with a folder of tenant testimonies an inch thick. Owen Fenwick sat near the back with his recorder running, and Corbin Achebe, in a clean button shirt that Yvonne had never once seen him wear, sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel he hadn't gone anywhere. The councillor's lawyer spoke first, dense with the kind of language designed to make a simple wrong sound like a complicated misunderstanding. Then Priscilla spoke, methodical and unshaken, walking the chamber through the timeline, the inspections, the ownership records, while the councillor's face went through several shades of composure. Then it was Yvonne's turn. She had not planned a speech. She had planned, mostly, to survive the walk to the podium without her hip betraying her. But when she got there, when she looked out at the room, Walter, Corbin, Priscilla, a dozen of her elderly neighbors who'd shown up because someone had finally given them a reason to believe it mattered. Something in her steadied the way it used to steady behind the counter, decades of practice rising up underneath the fear. "My name is Yvonne Marchand," she said. "I worked 31 years for this province processing licenses for people who never once thanked me and frequently yelled at me, because that was the job, and I did it honestly every single day. 6 weeks ago, 2 officers of this city told me, in front of a room full of witnesses, that nobody was coming to help me. They were almost right. Nobody was coming, until somebody decided to stay instead of walking past. She let that land before continuing. I am not a liability to this neighborhood. I am this neighborhood. I have lived in it for 40 years. I raised my children in it. I am raising my grandson in it now. And I will not sit quietly while people who have never once sat in my booth at Mabon's diner decide that my presence is bad for somebody's investment numbers. The chamber, which had been restless through the lawyer's remarks, went entirely still. It was Walter who played the footage next. The recording from that Tuesday morning, Drudge's voice ringing out clear through the chamber's speakers. Nobody's coming to save you, lady. This neighborhood's getting cleared whether you like it or not. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. The counselor's resignation came 11 days later, ahead of a formal ethics investigation that ultimately substantiated every allegation Fenwick had reported. Penrose Urban's permits were suspended pending review. Constables Drudge and Pell were both placed on administrative leave, and Drudge, facing a harassment complaint with video evidence attached, ultimately resigned rather than face the disciplinary hearing. What came after surprised everyone, including Yvonne, who had expected, at most, a quiet sense that justice had been done and nothing more. Priscilla Annan's tenant advocacy organization suddenly flooded with attention and, more usefully, donations asked Yvonne to join as a community liaison, paid, part-time, work that drew directly on 3 decades of patient, careful counter experience. Walter reopened Mabon's permanently and, within the year, converted the back room into a modest community space where Priscilla's group held tenant rights workshops every other Saturday. And the building itself, Yvonne's building, the one Penrose Urban had wanted emptied, was, 12 months later, purchased outright not by a developer, but by a newly formed tenant cooperative, funded in part by a settlement the city was forced to pay following the ethics investigation, and in part by an anonymous donor who turned out, when the paperwork was finally signed, to be Corbin Achebe, who had quietly been saving his disability settlement for 5 years, without any particular plan for it, until the morning a clipboard-wielding constable told an old woman that nobody was coming for her. He told Yvonne about the money the same way he told her most things, plainly, without much ceremony, sitting across from her in their usual booth at Mabon's, on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of Canadian winter light that makes everything look a little softer than it is. "You didn't have to do that," she said, for the second time in their friendship, though this time her eyes were wet. "Felt like somebody did," he said again, and this time they both laughed. A year after that Tuesday morning, the building had a new name on the lease. Marchand House. The tenants had voted, over Yvonne's strong objections that were overruled unanimously, and a small plaque by the front door that simply read, "No one here stands alone." Desian, now 18 and headed to college on a scholarship Priscilla had helped him find, still came down most evenings to help with the workshops, quiet as ever but steadier now, the flinch at raised voices mostly gone. On the anniversary of that first confrontation, Yvonne walked to Mabon's the same way she always did, cane in hand, navy coat buttoned against the cold, and found her usual booth already occupied by a man with a gray beard and 2 black coffees waiting on the table, one for him and one, already exactly the way she liked it, for her. "Figured you'd be along," Corbin said. She sat down across from him, looked out at the street where the streetcars still ran the same as they always had, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply be still.